Alright, so I'm posting this on my channel now because, there's 10 of you that are subscribed, and, I figure at least give you, you know, some thoughts of mine. I mean, because then again, nowadays, you have so many channels out there that either throw out AI shit or they, have, a bunch of editing in their videos. And, right now I'm not doing editing with my videos. I do have a video editor on my phone, so I might try and experiment with that a bit. For some reason, it doesn't work on a laptop, so that sucks. Be nice, but I thought I would just I thought I'd talk a little about my decision to move, to leave. I'm afraid. Now that I've made up my mind, I'm afraid to fail because I've spent a good chunk of my life not actually knowing struggle. I'm pretty privileged to say that. I'm 32 and I've never struggled before in my life. I worked through college and paid for it on my own, but I lived with my parents. So, I worked on and off part-time and full-time to save up money and do that. I graduated with minimal debt. I had like maybe $1,900 in debt, and I paid that off in like a month or two. And, I had a 6-figure salary job. At one point, I saved up a bunch of money from that. I probably could have saved more than what I have now, but depression spending. And, I had lost that job beginning of this year, and I quickly found another job. I was lucky to find another job. And of course that wasn't without help anyway. So I didn't even get it solely on my own. And, I have a job now, I have savings, I'm continuing to save some money, and, it's just, there's so much uncertainty in just jumping ship and leaving, this state behind. I'm leaving behind a few friends, a few good friends, but they're busy with their own lives. I don't think I'd be heavily missed, because we don't even hang out much because they have their own lives, and I get that. And, I just spend my days on repeat. I get up, I go to work, I go to the gym, eat some dinner, come home, relax for maybe like a couple hours, I get ready for the next day and go to bed. I do that 5 days a week, and then the weekend, I get to hang out with a bunch of cool people, and that's fine and all. It's just, I feel like each week has been on repeat. And, I don't like the environment here. I don't like the city. I liked it better out on the West Coast, so there was, more scenic views. My cat's being super attentive right now. But, I'm afraid of not having what it takes to survive in this world. And, this be the first time where I have to go out and survive in a new environment. An environment that is much more expensive than Texas, but, I would also rather live in a state where they don't try to, rig elections. They're doing it now, but they're doing it in retaliation to what the fuck Texas is doing. So, hey, at least the governor of California has a bit of a spine. I'll give him that. Doesn't mean I admire the guy, but it just means, at least someone has a fucking backbone. But, that's ultimately not gonna be my final destination. That's gonna be a stepping stone, and it's just, would my family be willing to accept me and allow me to live with them, at least for the most part rent-free? I would help with the utilities, I would help with what I'm using, obviously, but, would they allow me this opportunity to save and make the jump, to a different environment where I might not even have any friends out there? Oregon and Washington, I would be alone. And it's terrifying to think of, but, I think the trade-off would be worth it. I would be in an environment that makes me feel better. you know, maybe I have a job that I like, you know, maybe something that's simplistic. I don't know, you know, I would like a job where I feel like I'm contributing something, where I feel like I matter. And, you know, I don't feel that currently. I'm not saying that I'm complaining, you know, I'm lucky to have what I have. It's just, I'm terrified. And, you know, I'm just, part of me is afraid that I'm not making the correct decision. But, you know, the more I think about it, the more I realize, you know, if I'm comfortable all my life, am I really living? You know, if I don't go after what I want, am I living? You know? And I don't want to stay in Texas forever, if I'm being honest. You know, I didn't want to be in the state for, you know, forever. I wanted to get out at some point. And, you know, it's just, that's what I'm feeling, you know. That's part of the reason why I have, you know, my suicidal ideations, in part. You know, depression plays a role. Me overanalyzing the world and understanding just what an awful place it is does lend to that. But, you know, the other factor is I don't even know if I have what it takes to survive. You know, even given my skill sets, it's like, it's so difficult to even try to get a job that would even pay you enough to survive, to even live, to like pay your bills and even save a little just to live. It just makes you wonder, what is the point? So that's partly why I have those thoughts. And I'm just afraid this time I would fail. And that would be my last failure. You know, I don't know. Just kind of mulling it over. This isn't going to be an immediate decision. I'm not packing my bags right now, but, you know, I'm looking at the cost of living, you know, in my hometown, and I would need to make about like 60% more than what I'm making now in my home city to live. So to have the same standard of living. And I just don't even know if that's feasible, at least right off the bat. So, you know, I don't know. And then to move actually where my aunt and uncle live in California would be even more expensive. It would be, what, 70% more expensive than what it is here for the same standard of living. And it's just, you know, I don't even think I'd have what it takes to survive out there. You know, my skill sets are in art, my skill sets are in tutoring or instructing people in math and physics. You know, I had done it for 6 years at a community college, and then I did it on and off, you know, for different tutoring centers. You know, I have some experience in the semiconductor industry, some, just probably not enough to make me really valuable. You know, I can do manual physical labor. You know, I'm strong and capable of moving heavy things. It's just, I don't know. I'm not saying this to bitch or complain. I'm just saying this because, you know, I'm afraid to get uncomfortable. And this will be the most uncomfortable I've ever been, by far. So, but anyway, I thought I would just give an update, you know, on how things are going. So, yeah, I will keep you posted. Bye.